as we can tell, banks don't adjudicate insured mortgages differently than from insured mortgages, uninsured mortgages. And so, and I've got the answers to your question, your prior question. And so, at an extreme, we'd worry about it. For a short period of time, this is a regime that's served us well in Canada, and it means that we have a CMHC to absorb losses like this and help people stay in their homes. There are something like, well, as I said to you, we think deferrals could get up to 20%. Right now, 12% of mortgages are in deferral, either through support through ourselves and the private mortgage insurers or banks directly. And that's a form of resilience, I'd suggest to you. And sorry, if I may answer your prior question?
Please.
So our moderate stress test would suggest we could have claims losses of up to $9 billion over time as a result of these events.
Okay, thank you for getting that information so quickly. And then finally, you are buying mortgages from banks, basically, and other insured lenders. They want to get the maximum price for the mortgage products you're buying from them. And their shareholders depend on getting the best price. You don't have the same profit motive discipline over at CMHC or a government-owned entity. How do we as taxpayers know that you, and therefore we, are not overpaying for these hundreds of billions of dollars of mortgage products that you're buying on our behalf?
So the only mortgages that we're buying are through the Insured Mortgage Purchase Program.
Right.
I've given you the pricing of that in a chart, or it will come to you through the chair. You will see that our pricing is deliberately competitive versus market products. In fact, we peg it off something called covered bonds.
Right.
Covered bonds are sold in the market to European investors. They're effectively securitized mortgage bonds. Those right now are in US dollars, 1.66%, in euros, 1.63%. We are charging for IMPP 1.71 to 1.88%. And we're doing that deliberately to make sure we're not the cheapest form of money and subsidizing this lending.
And covered bonds are, last question, covered bonds are an alternative to government-backed mortgages, but they constitute a very small part of the Canadian landscape.
Yes.
Why have we not moved away from governments backing up the holdings of banks towards covered bonds, which are widely used in Europe and which keep the risk and reward firmly together in one product and in private hands?
Yeah, indeed, we have somewhat, and OSFI relaxed the so-called encumbrance limits, which allows banks to issue more covered bonds as a result of this crisis. It's a move that we at CMHC support, both in terms of diversity of funding and in making sure, as you say, that Canadians and banks aren't too reliant on the federal government. That said, as I said earlier, having CMHC as a public policy instrument in these times is a form of stabilization, and we certainly saw it in our performance in the last crisis compared to the U.S.
Thank you. Thank you both. We're quite a bit over there, but I think we're on a theme. Nice to finish it. Thank you both. Mr. Fraser and then Mr. St. Marie. Sean?
Hello. Sorry, I had to adjust my microphone. Thank you so much to our witness for being here. I know you mentioned you're here without a haircut. I recently got a haircut in the very seat I'm sitting in now. I let my wife do it in the living room, so if it looks a little unprofessional, I have her to actually thank. I think it's passable, that's for sure.
You're a braver man than me.
So look, first question. There's a major commercial real estate landlord based in my community. Upon the announcement of the commercial rent assistance program being rolled out, one of the very first calls I made was to them to ask how if it was going to help their tenants stay in business if they take access. And they very quickly pointed out that the lack of clarity around why someone may need a mortgage in order to take part in the program was potentially going to be an obstacle. One of the things that I committed to do was to go back to the government and see if we could make sure that businesses that perhaps don't take mortgage debt but may issue unsecured bonds to finance properties or some other instrument could similarly have access. Could you comment on how a business like that will be able to access the commercial rent assistance program?
The commercial the SECRA, as we call it, we live in an acronym-rich environment, I'll use the acronym, was designed to be delivered through CMHC just because it's easier to do that. By virtue of our legislation, we had to do that through a mortgage or find another way. And you'd be amazed at how much work it took to find another way. But in summary, we did by having a mortgage ready to register that we don't register, and that upon forgiveness is relieved. And so there's a technical way for us to deliver this program to landlords who do not have mortgages.
It strikes me that this is sort of similar to some of the other programs that have been launched by the government over the past number of months. It's really a matter of using the existing mechanisms to get cash to distressed businesses or households as quickly as possible and figuring out how to expand those on the heels of the program being introduced. Is that sort of a fair assessment as to how this particular decision went?
We knew we'd find a solution. We were very confident we would, but until we had authorities and clarity on that, we couldn't say so. So we announced it with confidence we could deliver.
Excellent, thank you. I think it is helping, for the record, quite a few businesses. I want to just go to some of the scary data that you shared during your remarks, as my colleague Mr. Polyev put it. I think the scariest piece for me was the fact that you said it's going to be 2030 before you can project that everyone's going to have access to a home they can afford, notwithstanding the financial difficulties that others are in. It's unconscionable to me today that homelessness is such a prevalent feature of Canadian society, and I think this pandemic has really shone a light on not just the social and economic consequences, but the public health consequences that people face if they live in a housing insecure environment. I'm curious if you have suggestions on what the federal government could most effectively turn its mind to help expedite the effort to provide affordable access to a home for all Canadians.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I do want to say, if I may, that I didn't project it would be by 2030. It's our aim. You know, we've had persistent homelessness in this country, and eradicating that and making sure everyone in Canada has a home they can afford and that meets their needs is a reason we have an entity like CMHC. The building of affordable rental housing in dense locations will be most supportive of economic growth. It's sustainable economically and environmentally. Unfortunately, urban sprawl itself creates a need for passenger car transportation, which is not good from a greenhouse gas point of view. You know, and then the other thing is, as I showed you on one of the slides, inequality and higher levels of GDP per capita actually are related to housing. And we've kind of overdone our support for home ownership in this country. And when we do that and supply doesn't keep up because of long lead times, approvals, et cetera, then we have high house prices. So we have to attack both the supply and demand side of the equation.
Thank you. Just very, very quickly, you mentioned a significant potential decline over the next year or so of housing prices. Do you anticipate that is going to be a short-term blip on the radar with an eventual bounce back? Or are you projecting this as a market correction that's going to have some staying power?
Thank you. We are projecting a recovery that will probably achieve current or pre-crisis levels in 2022. I should say, by the way, if I may just use this time to say that our estimate of losses is that something like 2% of insured mortgages could experience losses. That was a question Mr. Polyev asked.
And Mr. Chair, do I have time for one more question? Thank you.
Yes, you do.
Thank you. Finally, and I'll let you use the rest of my time in your response. We heard from certain witnesses on occasion about the cost of inaction or not taking measures to intervene in the economy. You've pointed to the insured mortgage purchase program of $150 billion that would inject essentially liquidity in the bank's ability to lend to other sectors. I'm thinking about that program and more broadly, can you talk about the social or economic cost if there had not been a serious economic intervention, not only on the insured mortgage purchase program, but more broadly in the income supports for people and businesses that would have an impact on the housing or mortgage sector?
Most certainly. You know, our primary defense, of course, against this virus are healthcare workers, but a very close second is a secure sanctuary of a home. And you know, we're seeing in places where that housing is a little more precarious, whether it's long-term care or homeless people, the difference in that. And so, income support has actually been the primary measure through which people are paying their rent and staying in homes. So the CERB, the Canada Emergency, I can't remember what CERB stands for. I've got so many acronyms in my head, forgive me, has been the primary form of rental support. And it's been such that we didn't feel we had to offer supplemental rental support on top of that.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions.
Okay, thank you both. Turning then to Mr. St. Marie and on to Mr. Julian. Gabriel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, Mr. Siddall. Thanks for being with the committee to answer our questions this afternoon. Here is my first question. You may find it quite vast. If you had to compare realty for the business sector and the residential sector with the crisis we have now and the one we had with commercial paper 10 years ago, how would you compare, and what is the role of CMHC in that?
Our responsibilities touch the residential sector, not the commercial sector. And so my answer would be speculative, but I will say that, how we're working seems to be different. People are becoming used to working from home. I know at CMHC, we had already planned to do this, reduce our footprint from 4 buildings to 1. And I think that could happen and could reduce the demand and price pressure on commercial real estate. Residential real estate, on the other hand, we're going to go through an adjustment, which is, I think, primarily debt-driven because people are under pressure. That doesn't exist as acutely in the commercial sector. And so we're going to suffer some adjustment for sure, and then recover in a year and a half, 2 years' time.
Thank you. In your opinion, what will be the impact of this crisis on property prices? There is a loss of income, there will be many more bankruptcies, and this could put a downward pressure on prices. But the injection of liquidity in the economy could have the opposite effect. At least this is what many economists are saying. With an injection of liquidities, it could have the effect of increasing prices. What do you think?
It's a tricky question. So we forecast that house prices on average nationally will decline 9 to 18%. There will be greater declines in places that are oil producing regions, of course, Alberta, some part of Saskatchewan and Newfoundland, and also in places where house prices got ahead of themselves, Toronto and Vancouver, or more ahead of themselves, if you will. Governments create a bridge to the future by providing liquidity. And so we've done that through the Insured Mortgage Purchase Program. That bridge needs a landing place. We need a solid foundation for economic growth. And I think as the days emerge, as we come out of this, we're starting to test in your province and in Ontario and a few other places what restarting an economy looks like. Hopefully we can do that in a responsible way, and that bridge comes sooner, and that liquidity will dissipate over time as growth pays for it.